Governor Hochul is touting the growing sales for legal cannabis in New York. She says the state weed industry has now passed $1 million in sales. There are currently 275 retail dispensaries open for business. Cannabis sales brought in more than $80 million in revenue for the state last fiscal year. And halfway through the fiscal year, it's already brought in $67 million in state revenue. At the same time, the state has been cracking down on people selling marijuana illegally.